Hello and welcome to the first annual Pody Awards. Now introducing your hosts, Sam and Honor. Hello. Hi. Hello, everyone. Thank you. Oh my God.
Thank you for having us.
Well, it's that time of year again for the potties.
Yep, again.
The biggest night in podcasting.
What a year it's been.
And Honor, you know what I was thinking?
What, Sam?
We should make a podcast out of this.
We should make a podcast. Oh my gosh, they're bringing us golden microphones? Welcome to
Podpodcastcast. Hello and welcome to Podpodcastcast. It's a podcast where we review other podcasts, and today is the first annual Pody Awards.
It is.
Honor, I'm so excited. Honor, you know what Potty stands for? Podcast of the Year.
Yeah.
Honor, here's what we're going to do today. I'm so excited. We're going to kind of do a little year in review episode here for the listeners. We're going to give our podcast of the year. I want to give our third, second, and first favorite podcast.
Yep.
Ultimately, the first being our podcast of the year.
Podcast of the year.
Our potty. And then I also want to talk about our potty. Our podcast. Ooh, that there's yucky.
Yeah.
Worst podcast of the year. A podcast that was a real stinker. You didn't like it at all.
Yep. This is going to be a real test of our abilities as podcasters, as we have to make sure to differentiate audibly between potty and potty every time.
It's going to be real hard. I think what I'm just going to do is I'm going to say potty, podcast of the year, and potty.
You already forget?
Podcast, obviously trash, truly yours.
Yeah.
It's the bad one.
Yeah.
All right, Honor. How about you start us off? What is your third favorite podcast of 2024?
My third favorite podcast. So I will preface by saying a lot of the podcasts I've brought onto the podcast have been podcasts that I'll go, oh, I listened to this 4 years ago or whatever it is.
Yeah.
I bring on a lot of podcasts from my past. So I tried to keep it to...
You sound like you're going on a first date and you have a lot of emotional baggage.
Yeah.
I bring a lot of pods from my past.
I bring a lot of pods. One of my earliest podcasts I talked about was one that I'd listened to years ago, but I was still mad about not being good. That was one of the first things I did.
That's true. Yeah. So we're not talking about podcasts that came out this year. We're talking about podcasts that we talked about this year.
Yeah, but I wanted to try to keep it more on the side of podcasts that are from this year or recently, or that I listened to this year. This one is not necessarily a recent podcast, though, but it was one that I'd only listened to this year. It was number one on my Spotify Wrapped.
Whoa.
Yeah. Podcast I'd listened to the most, apparently, and honestly was surprising to me, but I was like, yeah. I was surprised at how much I'd enjoyed it when I listened. It is Serial.
Serial? That's crazy.
Isn't it?
What? I'm actually flabbergasted that that is your third favorite podcast of the year.
Honestly,
you only listened to one season, right?
I only listened to one season, but apparently it was the one... I listened to a lot of different podcasts this year, so it was the one I'd spent the most time listening to one thing. But yeah, I only listened to the one season because I was very, very busy this summer, but I listened...
You were in the van, as our listeners may recall.
I was in the van, and honestly, that's most of the time where I was when I was listening to Serial, was on the many drives I had to do between locations. I did a lot of deliveries this summer. But I would always put it on when I got in the car, and it was just great to listen to. I enjoyed listening to it more than I thought I would. Especially because we've talked about the fact that we don't like true crime podcasts.
We introed that episode saying we don't like true crime. And your third favorite podcast of the year is a true crime podcast.
It is Serial. Yeah.
You're blowing my freaking brain right now, dude.
Yeah, which I also think is probably surprising because I I had a lot of critically positive things to say about the podcast, but I also had not zero negative things to say about places that fell flat and stuff. But it's made by professionals. It started with This American Life, people who are really good at audio storytelling.
True. It's one of the classic, I would say the classic podcast for
Yes. That's another thing I just really enjoyed, going back, thinking critically about how it has shaped the medium as a whole, because it was one of the grandfathers of podcasting. That was their novel idea, was that, oh my gosh, we can tell a story over audio, radio, but it's multiple episodes. Whoa, you know what that is now? It's a podcast.
So, yeah. That was definitely going to be one of my honorable mentions. Serial is an interesting podcast.
It's good.
I think I enjoyed some of the later seasons more than the first.
Yeah.
Although they're very different. Which is also funny. It is funny that we came into that episode and we were both like, we don't like true crime episodes or true crime podcasts. And we both quite like that true crime podcast. I guess that was kind of the conclusion of that episode as well. I'm just surprised it ranks so high for you.
Yeah, I was also surprised.
You're in the foxholes, okay? You're in the trenches. You're poking your head up in the land of audio dramas, okay?
Yes.
That's the battle that you fight.
Yeah.
And so for you to come in here and not give me 3 straight audio dramas, frankly, I am flabbergasted.
Yeah, I know. I was also shocked. But I was like, it's worth something that is the podcast I listen to the most. It was something that I looked forward to putting on every time I got an opportunity to listen to 20 minutes of it. I enjoyed it. I was like, dang. That one was pretty good. So does my number 3 Poddy.
That's very excellent. My number 3 Poddy.
Tell us about it, Sam.
Is a podcast that we both enjoyed.
Mm-hmm.
A podcast that appeals to everyone, from me to my sister to my mom.
I know which one it is.
It's Midnight Burger.
It's Midnight Burger. It's so classic.
Midnight Burger is a tremendous audio drama that we talked about a lot. About, a gang of plucky adventurers going through space and time. Yeah, it's so good. I look into, there's so many podcasts that we talked about, and I was like, man, I don't know. And then Midnight Burger just kind of snuck on my list. I'm like, there's a lot of podcasts I really like, but I have to think every time I listen to Midnight Burger, not every time, but every time I listen to Midnight Burger seasons 1 through 2, I enjoyed it more than almost any other podcast that we've talked about this year.
I feel like if there was going to be a potty for Podpodcastcast as a whole, it might have to be Midnight Burger, because I feel like we talk about it a lot when we're comparing things to other podcasts. It's one of the ones that we've had the most people go, hey, we listened to your episode on Midnight Burger, and now I listened to Midnight Burger. It might be the most successful in that area. Feels classic.
Yeah, and Midnight Burger is also our longest podcast at an hour and 47 minutes.
Wow.
We talked about it for so long, and I think we only got through season 1.
Yeah, it was a real rush at the end to get through the rest of it.
And you edited in, what is it, Hall of the Mountain King?
I put Hall of the Mountain King over it.
It's so interesting. I've heard, so my mom, hi mom, if you're listening, I love you so much. My mom has started listening to Midnight Burger and has listened to season 4, which is one I haven't listened to, because season 3 I actually really didn't like. Yeah. And she says that season 4 is worse.
It's so
it focuses on the main characters less. The story is less interesting. And my mom is a hero. She's like, I'll keep listening to it, but it's not that good.
Thank you, Sam's mom, for doing this work.
Seasons 1 through 2, really good.
Really good.
Just don't stop there, because it has a fine enough ending after that. Like, there are mysteries, but just accept that there is no satisfying answer to those mysteries, and it's not coming in the next 30 hours of podcast.
Awesome.
Midnight Burger, super good. I love it. I didn't listen to it for the first time this year. Re-listened to it. I'm like, oh my gosh, it's so good. I talked about this on the podcast. I stayed up for 2 hours listening to the finale of season 3.
Yeah.
Which is very silly. But it's so good. I loved it. It's got to be up there for me. So that's why it's my 3rd favorite podcast of the year. Not my potty.
Yeah.
Not my potty. My third favorite podcast of the year.
Third favorite podcast.
We're rising up the ranks.
Yeah.
Which leads us to your second favorite podcast of the year.
Second favorite podcast.
You're almost Potty.
Almost.
You're quasi Potty.
Mm-hmm.
You're Potty -1.
Yep.
Which is?
This one's more predictable. This one is the Magnus Protocol.
Ah!
This was my second most listened to podcast. It's very good. I mean, I talked about my little experiment that I did.
Evil experiment.
Evil experiment.
You made me listen to it without any context, but it seems like the context was necessary.
Yeah. It is an extremely good sequel podcast. It is really good at creating tensions and intrigue based on what returning listeners are wondering about, past the finale of the Magnus Archives. It sets up so many things well in that area, which makes me feel like screaming and putting my co-host through trials and tribulations in order to prove Alexander J. Newell wrong when he's like, you don't have to listen to the first one. No, you should embrace that because it's a really good sequel podcast. You should be like, hey, we made a sequel and it's really good if you're someone who's listened to the first podcast.
Have you continued to listen to it beyond the 20 episodes that we talked about?
A little bit. There are more episodes that are out that I have not listened to yet, but I will. I've just been busy.
It's still not finished.
It's still not finished. No.
Okay.
But I'm excited for when more will come out. I kind of like to listen to it in spurts to where I can listen through a bunch of episodes at once.
Right. We've talked about this kind of off and on, but I would be driven insane by listening to many podcasts like episodically as they come out.
Yeah.
There's a podcast I'm listening to right now, which I was like, oh my gosh, new season. Let me listen to the whole thing. And it wasn't done and I'm crying.
Yeah, I like to listen to stuff that, if it's actively coming out, listen in groups of like 5 or so. I don't feel the same need and compulsion that you do to listen to everything at once, and it has to be finished.
It must be complete.
Because I'm okay. I'm at peace within myself, and I am
mentally well.
I can handle when something isn't done yet.
I can't.
I can't.
I feel like there should be some flashback to some sort of childhood trauma where I miss some one puzzle piece. It's caused me to be this way, but I am this way. Yeah.
But yeah, it's really good podcast, really good at being a sequel. Please, Alexander J. Newell, to know this and acknowledge this and embrace this and be happy with what you have made. But know that you're wrong in saying that new people can listen to it without context.
Alexander J. Newell, please email into the podcast at podpodcastcast@gmail.com.
That'd be crazy if he ever hears this. There's definitely personal bias in that I really like their brand of horror, but also their whole tone and atmosphere. They really know exactly what they're going for. They have a really good handle on that. It just has a very cohesive feel in that way of they know what their whole deal is. And there's really interesting characters that I really like and enjoy, and I want to see what horrible, terrible things happen to them in the future.
Honor, I'm glad you liked that podcast.
Thanks. I'm also glad I liked it.
But it's not my second favorite podcast of the year.
I would figure. That makes sense.
And you also might be able to guess my second favorite podcast of the year.
Maybe.
I guess we'll never know. Because my second favorite podcast of the year is one that actually came out this year. Is going to be also my Pody Award for Best New Podcast of 2024. It's the Lonely Island and Seth Meyers podcast.
Yes, this makes sense.
The Lonely Island and Seth Meyers podcast is good. Jenny recommended it to me. She was like, Sam, you got to listen to this. This is really good. And I have always been a big fan of The Lonely Island. Seth Meyers, don't care. But I just really enjoyed getting to learn more about these comedy boys that I really like. And it's one of the few podcasts. I shouldn't say one of the few. It's one of several podcasts that I've listened to for Podpodcastcast and then have kept in my rotation afterwards.
Yeah.
Every Monday.
It's a good sign.
It's really good. It's a good talk show. They're funny. I really enjoy the guys. Every Monday I'm like, I gotta listen to the new one. And I hit it in 20 minutes and then I'm done. And I'm like, okay, cool. I'll keep bopping around.
Nice.
It's so good. It's quickly becoming a comfort podcast for me. It's one that does genuinely make me laugh. It is also one that just always sends me to YouTube to look up the clips they're talking about.
Yeah.
But these guys have a really good dynamic, which is just so fun to kind of be a part of. And it's pretty light and breezy. You know, it's a bit of a popcorn if it was a snack.
Yep.
You know, it's not a big deal, and you can just kind of tune into it. It's just a really solid, funny show. You know, I've listened to several kind of talking shows, talking podcasts this year, and I think this one is definitely my favorite, of just dudes sitting around. Even the interview podcasts, while there's others that I think are have higher highs, like the Conan O'Brien Needs a Friend podcast, a lot of time that will make me laugh more, but I don't always want to tune into it. You know, sometimes I'm like, I don't care what Timothée Chalamet has to say on this episode, you know, when Conan interviews him. But I do almost always want to hear what, you know, Andy Samberg and Akia Schaefer and Jorma Taccone and I guess Seth Meyers have to say. I'm like, these guys are very silly. You know, even some of the episodes were like, man, the digital short we're discussing, the video you guys made, sucks.
Yeah.
It's really bad.
Awesome.
Those are also really funny. I mean, their chemistry just works really well together. They get a bunch of different celebrities on here with voice notes, which is also fun. You know, if you're just have a hankering for, you know, other famous people or just comedy writers that are also very funny and leave very sarcastic voicemails, it's a great show. Oh, so good. So glad I got the recommendation on this one. I've been listening to it since like June, and I'm going to stick with it. It's a really good podcast.
Sounds wonderful.
It's a great pickup for me.
Sounds lovely.
All right, Honor.
It's time.
It's time to talk about our potties.
Potty.
P-O, that, there. Yikes.
Podcast wasn't in the name of that at all. You took it out.
No, it wasn't. This is our worst podcast of the year. We have listened to some stinkers.
Yeah.
I think individually we've both gone out and listened to some that were like, we don't like this. And there have been some contentious book clubs. Book club clubs.
For sure.
Where I'm like, Honor, I listened to this and I think it's bad. And you're like, Sam, I think you might not have ears.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, we've butted heads. But we've certainly both had podcasts where like, this is not good. You know, we serve as a beacon, a guiding light unto the masses towards the beautiful paradise of good podcasts. But also a warning sign. A sketchy, buzzing, neon flashing sign that says "Do not enter" to some other podcasts.
Yep.
Honor, what is your potty, your worst podcast of the year?
So
should I edit in a toilet flush sound?
Follow your heart.
Okay, there we are. Get it because it's Poddy?
Poddy.
What's your worst podcast?
Yep. So this one I think is also going to be very surprising. Because it's not necessarily a podcast that I really raved about how much I didn't like. Also, I will say I thought I was more of a hater this year.
Oh.
I looked back at I scrolled through all of our episodes to make sure I thought about every podcast that we've listened to and talked about. And really, there weren't that many podcasts that I reacted negatively toward. At least not in a crazy way. I will say that our Joe Rogan episode is coming out next, which means we can't talk about it in this recap, but just
a dishonorable mention.
Look forward to that.
Yeah, it's also. I mean, it's fair to note that like it's hard to listen to a bad podcast. You know what I mean? Like some people will be like, "I played this video game for 30 minutes and it was terrible," and you're like, okay, I feel like that's a fair experience, you know what I mean? Or like, I sat through this movie for 1 hour. To listen to like, and especially you listen to a lot of audio dramas, to listen to like a 20-hour or even like a 10-hour audio drama and it sucks.
Yeah.
It's painful.
That's not what I've brought on for this though.
Okay.
It hasn't been anything that I've really been like, oh my gosh, this sucked. Because anything that I've really raved about when I was looking back was something that I thought had a lot of intrigue and a lot of potential and then fell flat. But there was still these elements that I thought were good and wish they had latched onto more, and that was what made me really mad, was that they didn't capitalize on what I thought was good. This is a podcast that I looked back and went, do I remember anything about what this podcast was about? And I was like, I just feel like I can't ignore that I don't really remember what this podcast was about. And that is Untrue Stories.
That's it's
a fun one. It was a fun listen when I listened to it. It's silly, it's goofy, but there's so much that they don't tie up. There's so much that's like confusing. And I remember saying in that episode that if you're all right with being confused, then you can just have fun. But also, why must you be resigned to being confused, you know? And then now I'm like, I don't remember. I know they were fun. It was funny. They were funny guys. Yeah. There was time travel. They were writing the book.
See, that one was it was just funny to me. It was like, I don't take this one that seriously, and I didn't care that much about it. You're right, it's not a super memorable podcast. Mm-hmm. But I am surprised. Surprised because there were ones that you're like, this was bad, or this could have been so much better. Yeah. This one you had frustrations with.
No, I didn't talk about it very negatively in the episode where we talked about it, but it was a looking back that I was like, because again, the ones that I really talked negatively about were things that I was like, I really felt like they could have done better. It was more of an extreme up and down with the ones that I really ranted about, was because there were good and promising things about those podcasts. And so I remember those. There are interesting things from those. Like if I think about Fairy or Where the Stars Fell, those were the other two that were really in contention for me of potential potties. But they both had things that I did like and that were interesting. There were interesting characters. There was some interesting good production elements, where Untrue Stories, I think, of everything I look back on, fell the most just flat. It wasn't really memorable.
Yeah. It's not that it was like that bad. It was that really emotions in either direction. Yeah. It was very minimal. Like if you were a wave, your amplitude was very low while listening to Untrue Stories. Even when you hated something else. It gave you something. There was some emotional response. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. I still think it's a fun little podcast, but of everything we listened to, meh.
Well, congratulations, Untrue Stories. On the first ever Potty!
I hope the creators never hear this.
That is surprising. Mm. Although I don't... That doesn't... I'm like, okay, yeah, I can see that. I don't think you'll be that happy about my Potty.
Yeah, I'm excited.
My podcast, ouch, that thorny yucca.
This is crazy.
I love this bit.
You have to be contained.
My least favorite podcast of the year is the Magnus Protocols.
This makes sense.
The Magnus Protocols was not good. Didn't like it. The Magnus Protocols, I see the faces you're making. I feel the anguish that I'm causing you. I know what you're going to... No, I know but it's part of your dastardly experiment.
Yeah,
that I feel
that's what I was
way.
about to say, is I just feel more vindicated.
Sure.
I feel more correct the more you say how much you didn't enjoy it.
Well, so here's the thing. Magnus Protocols is a Monster of the Week show. Mm-hmm. We got a spooky story. Mm-hmm. I didn't like the spooky stories. Mm-hmm. They were never that interesting to me. I don't like horror to begin with. Yeah. They had like an overarching plot. The overarching plot was frustratingly sidelined. Mm. It moved so tremendously little over 20 episodes and was the only thing I ever cared about. And at times it sucked. The characters would do things that actively frustrated me, where it's like, please, just like don't be this way and like progress the plot. And it was so frustrating. But the meat of the podcast is the monster stories, and I really did not like them. Now, I know what
is fair.
You, Honor, would be like, Sam, you should listen to Magnus Archives.
Mm-hmm.
You'll get context, which is necessary. And I think if I had listened to all the Magnus Archives, I may like its sequel, The Magnus Protocol, more.
Yeah.
However, I will say I don't think I would like the Magnus Archives.
I also think that.
Yeah.
I thought what you were going to say was if I had listened to all of the Magnus Archives, I would have lost my mind.
I think that is also true. It's so long.
Yeah. It's very long. It's just a very different way of going about podcasts to the audio dramas we've talked about and we've both liked, and especially that you have liked, where it is, I mean, just put it very simply, they are shorter. It's more of a thing you listen to all at once.
Yeah.
It's a complete kind of bite-sized package in that way, even if it is like 20, 40 hours, whatever the longest thing you listened to was.
I think the longest thing we listened to together was 4359, which is somewhere in the range of 40 plus
That's
hours.
like in between.
Dude, don't.
This is long for you.
Bro, it's long. It's long for humans. It's long for humans.
Not true.
It may not be long for you and whatever supernatural mutations you've developed.
Yeah.
Super long. This podcast, we listen to 20 episodes. They're all like 30 minutes or something. Yeah. Less than that. So Magnus Protocol was long because I wasn't enjoying myself.
Yeah.
Which
is fair.
There are other podcasts that I do think I was a pretty big hater this year, you know?
Yeah.
And I appreciate you bringing on podcasts that you really enjoy and that I think other people have enjoyed.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's plenty of podcasts that we've talked about in book clubs where you're like, this is really good. And I'm like, I don't think so.
Yeah.
Edge of Sleep comes to mind, a show I didn't super enjoy, but it definitely just moved up for me above the Magnus Protocol because it has close to a completion. It has better sound design. There is more of a plot that's interesting to me. So the second ever Pody Award goes to Magnus Protocol. I keep forgetting what it's called. Trying to erase it from my memory.
I love you, Magnus Protocol.
I don't love you, Magnus Protocol. Stop calling me. All right. Let's move on to our honorable mentions before we get to our Poddy's podcast of the year.
Podcast of the year.
Honor, what are you some of your honorable mentions? And then what's your Poddy?
Definitely an honorable mention for me is Wolf 359, which we have talked about in multiple ways. A classic for me. Really love. I love that podcast.
It's a good podcast. It was also going to be on my honorable mention list.
Awesome.
I spent a lot of time on it this year.
Yeah.
If there was like a podcast that almost encapsulated Podpodcastcast podcast experience, it might be Wolf 359.
I think Wolf 359 and Midnight Burger might be the dynamic duo.
Sure. Yeah.
In that way.
One that's good and one that's long.
One that's good and one that's long.
Wolf 359 doesn't totally break my list because of some of the problems I talked about. Sometimes it's slow for me.
I'm honestly surprised it was on your honorable mentions at all because you had a lot of things you didn't like about it.
Because it's long and that the character work is fairly good. I really got attached to all those guys. And when it came to the end, I was like, some of that really frustrated me. And I thought the logic for this plot was dumb, but those are my dudes. And I think about it kind of, I'm like, oh, editing that podcast in my mind, in my memory.
Yeah.
I'm like, there's a fondness there that I look back with.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, definitely a classic for me. A good podcast. I also think maybe I have to say something about Critical Role because it's so classic and I have spent so many hours listening to Critical Role. Very formative of my podcast experience.
That makes sense.
Yep. And I think does, it's in the same realm of, we've talked about a lot of actual play D&D podcasts.
We've?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
We had a D&D episode.
We had a D&D. I've talked about one.
Yeah. You've talked about one.
Yeah, on this podcast, certainly, there's been much discussion of Dungeons & Dragons and Dungeons & Dragons play shows.
Yeah.
which Critical Role is by far the biggest.
I think it's good. I look back very fondly on that one for sure as well. But it is not my Poddy, despite my Poddy being another actual play podcast.
I have to stop myself from laughing.
Yeah.
Honor, what is your podcast of the year?
My podcast of the year is Edit in Drumroll. A Court of Fan Flowers from Dimension 20.
Oh. See, I feel like that might sneak up on the listeners because I forgot that you talked about it on the podcast.
Yeah.
But I know you as a human.
I was going to say, you know me and have heard me go through my life.
Oh, yeah.
And so
outside this podcast, you are on the Court of Fan Flowers grind. You love that
all
show.
All the time. I love it.
A crazy amount.
Yeah. I love that show. One of my bullet points I have written down just says, changed me.
That is, I cannot believe that is true. There's absolutely no way.
Maybe it's not. But if nothing else, gosh, I love it. It's so good. There's just a lot of people who are very good at what they do on that show. A lot of really passionate storytellers and comedians and artists. Abria Iyengar behind the creative direction and vision for the whole thing and game mastering the, actual play element itself. Phenomenal, and she puts so much work and passion into what she creates, and it made this awesome narrative and environment and atmosphere that just so many of the details are thought out and done with so much care. There's definitely, it's a video podcast. We've talked about that sort of idea. But even though there's a lot of work also put into visuals for that podcast, they're all ornamental and they're sort of decorative. You don't need them at all to listen to the story. There's not even a map for the battles or anything. It's all done through their voices. So you get the complete experience if you listen to it. And it's just phenomenal. I love it so much.
That, I shouldn't have been so surprised.
No.
You do talk about that one a lot.
I talk about it all the time.
It's like your main inspiration in the world of Dungeons & Dragons, which you love. You're a big D&D head.
Yeah, which even it branches outside of D&D in certain ways, which is just another thing of... I love Abria Iyengar so much. But another thing that she did with thought and care is realizing even just the game system that she was working in. She was like, it works for what she wants to do, but there's a better way to reflect the story and genre that we want to play in. And so she modified the game system itself. Just the whole thing from the ground up makes this cohesive, wonderful experience and story.
And the first ever Potty goes to A Court of Fan Flowers, which is a smaller part of a larger podcast that I can't remember at this time. Dimension 20.
A Court of Fan Flowers. That is my podcast of the year.
Wow, that's crazy. But also, cool. I get it. Yeah, that makes sense.
It's a good one. Probably my most, if anyone wants one podcast recommendation for me, pay the $5 or whatever to get on Dropout TV and listen to A Court of Fan Flowers.
All right. Then my honorable mentions, we already talked about Wolf 359. Mm-hmm. Definitely, it doesn't break my top 3, but it's in some way, it feels 2024 to me.
Yeah.
Other podcasts I thought about putting on my list included my NPR podcast, Planet Money, and First Up. Mm-hmm. Loved those shows. I got a lot of enjoyment out of them.
NPR makes good stuff.
They make good stuff, especially Planet Money. Ooh, give me that economics. Ooh, give me that economics.
Yeah.
But when I thought about the other things we had listened to, I didn't get the same I've got to listen to the next one as some of these other things. I also, you talked about it earlier, but for my honorable mentions, I had Serial. Mm-hmm. Serial also feels very similar to Wolf 359 to me. It's kind of like this year in podcasting for me, which is crazy because it's very old. But I listened to all 4 seasons, and I thought it was super fascinating, especially after the first season. It's less true crime. The second season is like a war story. The third season is like almost an expose on the criminal justice system in the United States, and the fourth season is about Guantanamo Bay. And listening to all those stories were super interesting, and I just got to learn a lot more about those things that I would not have sought out, but did find valuable.
Yeah.
But still, it was never like a, let's go listen to Serial, you know? Like, I was never that pumped about it.
Yeah.
My Poddy podcast of the year.
If I might pause you, there is one that I'm remembering now that I'm kind of surprised hasn't come up at all. Except I'm wondering now if it's going to be your Poddy. So maybe I should shut up.
Hey, thanks for that pause. I'm unpausing myself.
Sorry, yeah, you do that. I'll talk about it after if this isn't your Poddy.
My podcast of the year is a podcast, and when I listened to it, I was like, this is so good. It is still probably my standard of how good an audio drama can be. Every time I listened to it, I wanted to listen to the whole thing. It was an awesome, just delightful experience. I'm talking about our first episode ever.
That's what I thought.
Chrysalis! Oh, it's so good! Oh, my
Extremely deserved. Makes so much sense.
Chrysalis is such a good podcast.
Really good.
Chrysalis, audio drama about an AI that exists after the end of humanity, but it goes out into space and fights aliens
with nukes.
It's so good. Oh my gosh. If you're hearing my words right now talking about Chrysalis and you haven't listened to Chrysalis, go listen to Chrysalis.
Yeah.
It is such a tremendously good podcast. And no joke, the reason that this podcast exists.
It is.
I was at a party. Otter was there. I said, Otter, you like podcasts? Otter said, yeah. I said, you listen to Chrysalis. Otter come back, say, I listened. And I said, we make podcasts.
That is what happened.
It's just scientifically accurate.
That is. Yeah.
It's so good. It's not like, and okay, here, my sermon almost, Chrysalis is like 12 episodes long, or 13 or 14, something like that. And each episode is like maybe 30 minutes.
Yeah.
Dude, oh my gosh, dude, the amount of story that they can tell in that short a time is so good.
It is really
Wolf
good.
359 does not have that good of a story, and they take way longer to tell it. It is just a good narrative, and it is done well in the medium of podcast because here's the thing. It also uses the medium so well. There should not be a Chrysalis movie.
No.
It would not make any sense, and it would suck because you're getting the perspective of a machine that most of the time just looks like a big obelisk. Like it's a spaceship. That's the only thing the camera could ever focus on, and it wouldn't be interesting.
Yeah.
But you get to hear the machines as a person, its thoughts and its processes, and like how it's struggling with, I feel like a person, but clearly I am in like a server room. Like that's where my mind is. I control like drone swarms. That you get this internal perspective, which is well written, excellently voice acted. Is absolutely a treat. The other plot with the alien ambassador character, also so good. Both of them such wonderful explorations of what it means to be a person, and also like how to struggle with like catastrophe.
Yeah.
And also it's in space.
It's in space.
I love it so much. I feel like a little child on Christmas Day. Oh my gosh. It's so good. I every episode I'm like, ugh. This is so good. I want to learn more. It's also crazy because the first time I listened through it, I missed an episode, which was fairly critical.
Yeah.
And then when I listened to it again for this podcast, I was like, that's crazy that I missed that.
Yeah.
Dust is the name of the show. I believe it's season 3. Chrysalis.
Yeah. It is interesting that we've both picked things that are part of a larger podcasts.
Yeah, that is interesting.
When people make multiple things, they tend to make something that's good.
You think they just have enough? There's enough ammunition, shot that like one of them is gonna hit.
There's been studies about like classes for art classes that are based on quantity versus quality.
Sure.
And actually, normally the students who are graded based on quantity will make higher quality things because they just make more. They get more practice.
Sure. And that's.
So I think there's something there.
I think you're absolutely right that there's something there. I mean, it's also. I don't know exactly how true that is for Dust because kind of everything else Dust has made is really bad. And
That's fair.
They also picked up this story randomly off of Reddit that some just dude wrote.
I always forget that that's the origin.
But that dude is my hero. Dude, I forget your name at this moment. I'll give you a big kiss if you come on Podpodcastcast. I'll give you a big kiss if I see you. This is such a good story. Oh my gosh. Chrysalis is a reason that it was the first podcast we talked about. I still love it. If I look for an audio drama, I look for something that makes me feel like Chrysalis did. Oh my gosh. Just an excellent podcast. You gotta listen to it if you haven't.
Yeah.
I love it. It's my favorite podcast, period.
Fair.
And the award for best podcast ever goes to the second Potty goes to
Chrysalis.
Love you, Chrysalis. You're epic. Fantastic.
Woo! Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, it would have felt wrong for it to not come up at all. As a podcast that we both love so much, we should start talking about what it means to be a good podcast.
So good. It's absolutely so good. I mean, there's also so many other podcasts we talked about that I would love to spend another hour on. We've listened to a lot of good pods, man.
Yeah. And you perhaps have exactly how many pods?
Thanks for the segue, Honor. We're gonna move.
You're so welcome.
We're gonna move into what I'm calling Podpodcastcast Wrapped. We're wrapping up for the year. Everyone's getting their Spotify Wrapped. People who listen on Apple Podcast, I'm with you. I don't care either. But now that we've talked about the best podcast of the year, I want to talk a little bit about Podpodcastcast in this
year. The second best podcast of the year.
Podpodcastcast?
Yeah.
It was not on either of our second.
Be confident.
Hopefully it's the best podcast that you've listened to this year, listener. And hopefully we've helped you find some good podcasts.
Yeah.
I just kind of wanted to talk about what this year was like for Podpodcastcast. We started in April. We started in April. I keep forgetting that. I keep telling people we started in February or March. Not true.
Not true.
We started recording then, but we released our first episodes in April of this year. We have, not including this episode, released 19 episodes so far.
This is the 20th.
This is the 20th episode.
Happy 20th episode.
If I've done my calculations correctly, we have talked about 37 podcasts.
That is so many more than I thought.
Right? But it also, I'm looking at that number and I'm like, there's so many podcasts.
There's so many more.
It's crazy. Hopefully we've helped you find a good podcast out of those, or hopefully if you've looked up Magnus Protocol, we've helped you say no to that. Don't listen to it. Heart emoji on it.
Thanks, Sam.
We together, you and me, have listened to hundreds of hours of podcasts.
Yeah.
We've listened to so many podcasts this year.
My personal statistic from just Spotify, which isn't the only thing I listen to podcasts on, was over 3,000 hours this year.
3,000 hours or minutes?
I'm dumb.
Yeah, you told me minutes earlier. But what is it? 3,000 divided by 60? Honor, I've run the numbers. On Spotify, you've listened to 50 hours of podcast.
55, I believe. Because there was some extra.
Cool. Yeah, which is because you didn't listen to Wolf 359 again. I did. I listened to that show a lot.
Good job.
We've listened to a lot of podcasts this year, most of which have been pretty enjoyable. Even the stuff that I complain about, a lot of that time has been like, this is good.
Yeah. Like I said, I was surprised looking back at how few podcasts I was like, those were bad.
Which is good, right?
This is a good way to spend your year.
Podpodcastcast has 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.
Yes.
Clapping off mic.
Yes.
Thank you, listeners. We appreciate that. All of you who have rated and reviewed. We love you very much. We appreciate that and how it lets other people know that this is a good pod.
We're eating well. Yummy star bits.
Dude, what an insane callback. What an actually... Are you out of your mind? That you talked about that one time.
Starbits.
What? Shut up. That was on the Ash episode.
Yeah.
That was like 6 months ago.
Chunks?
We've had great discussions on Podpodcastcast about
For sure.
what is an appropriate length of a podcast.
Oh, yeah. I would love the statistic on how often we talk about what is too long of a
How
podcast.
many minutes do we spend on how long a podcast should be? Journey versus destination. We've talked about that a lot, especially on audio dramas that are not finished. Yep. I need a destination. I'm not traveling until you tell me where we're going. I don't mind going to Albuquerque, but you just got to tell me that we're getting there.
Yeah.
We talked about the Speed Wars, which I am a purist. 1 speed is the only appropriate speed to listen to a podcast or really any media on, unless you're trying to learn something really quickly.
I'm a rebel. I'm a revolutionary. Speed it up, dude.
You're 1.5.
1.5 is typically where I'm at.
Disgusting.
1.75 also a comfortable speed.
That's crazy. That
2 times speed is if I'm crunching for the next Podpodcastcast episode.
We also did we coin the term face shock, or did you get that from somewhere else?
I think we coined that.
I'm going to say we coined that. And future historians,
Yeah.
I'm sure you're all talking about face shock. Started right here, baby.
Started here.
Yeah. I don't look at people's faces when I like their podcast, unless I knew their face beforehand.
Yep.
Those are the rules. Your voice is a person to me. I don't want to know about you.
Yeah, we agree on this one thing.
It's true. And we've also got an awesome community of people.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone that emailed in, everyone that left a review, everyone that listens to the podcast. I am still I'm blown away by the support. I appreciate everybody that listens. We have gotten thousands of listens across Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, which is crazy.
Yeah.
But it's so awesome. It's so awesome to be able to interact with other people that care about podcasts. Sometimes other people that are vegans and will tolerate you as well.
Wow.
That's crazy.
What a Christmas miracle.
What a Christmas miracle that we've become tolerant of vegans.
Yeah.
Was that our first episode that we said we don't like vegans?
I think so. We haven't added anyone to our list of people we exclude in a long time.
That's true. We're becoming inclusive.
Yeah.
It's the corporate pressures. Oh my God. But really, everyone, we just appreciate it so much. I know I can say that for both me and Honor, that it's just, awesome and incredible.
Very much.
To get this community of people that like podcasts, because we like podcasts.
It's awesome.
It's very cool. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
All right. And for the last time of the year, I am going to go to our inbox at podpodcastcastpod@gmail.com.
Email in. You
can tell us whatever you want. Tell us what's on your heart. We'll give you advice if you're boy crazy. Not like broccoli. I have good ways to cook it. Let us know. All right. This email's subject line is deafening silence.
What a horrifying thing for a podcast about podcasts.
Hello, Sam and Honor. Your loyal fan base is greatly dismayed by your, all caps bold, deafening silence over the awesome fandom name PP, short for Pod heads. As a devout PP head myself, I feel saddened by your inaction. There is no other good name.
That's just not true.
I challenge you and fellow PP heads to find another. One that balances the purpose and humor of this pod. I most certainly can't. Also, if you were both dogs, Honor would be an old husky that's very sweet, maybe missing some teeth, but that in a good way, named Francis. But most people say Frank. And Sam would just be a Jack Russell Terrier named Fred, who has a sizable tuft of hair on his chin. #PPHead for life.
That is a really awesome assignment of what we would be like as dogs.
I don't really understand it, but I appreciate it nonetheless.
It's really good.
We
PP heads, however, is not good. And can we bleep that out every time it's said?
I think then we will really get in trouble for censorship. The people, I hope this is not like really coming up in the community. I hope this is a vocal minority.
Yeah.
I mean, podheads is better.
Podheads.
Listeners
I really
is fine.
like listeners. I think is good. I've always been attached to because of dear listeners from Wolf 359.
That does make me like it less. Yep.
Sam.
Podheads is good.
Podheads is good.
Podpodcasters. Podpodcastcasters.
Yeah.
PPCCers.
Yeah.
I
like podlings. Sometimes I think that to myself.
Yeah. I don't know. Do you guys want a name other than PP heads? Please someone write it.
It can be anything that's not PP heads.
I suppose.
Or adjacent.
I suppose if we get flooded with people from the inbox saying we are the PP heads, we have to accept that.
I will turn to tyranny.
But I just don't know what happened. Like when we get like the president on the podcast, he's got to be like, "Hello, PP heads."
Hello, PP heads.
Like
I guess if Kamala Harris can say "Daddy Gang,"
that sucks. No,
but
dude.
It's bad. I don't want to do.
No,
it's not. I don't want to be that.
It's not like that was a winning strategy for her. You know.
No.
Yeah, I don't. It's not good at all. I don't like PP heads. I don't know. Does anyone want to be a PP head? Like that's the thing.
No.
If you like join the community, you're like, oh yeah, man, I'm a PP head. Like,
no.
Do you want PP head merch?
No, I don't.
Yeah, I don't either.
I'm against it.
Yeah, I'm frightened. But thank you, listener, PP head.
Yeah, thanks for the dog assignments.
That felt
cool.
bad to say, by the way.
It feels like we're insulting them. I think
know.
That's why we can't have it stick.
Thanks for listening, idiots.
Yeah. I feel more comfortable saying idiots. Like, that's fun, at least.
Well, if you want to let us know your thoughts on that, you can email in at podpodcastcastpod@gmail.com. Please leave us a review wherever you're listening to this podcast. Rate 5 stars. Follow us so you know when we're posting a new thing, wherever you're listening to this podcast. And mostly, thank you for a wonderful year. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
This has been so much fun. I really enjoyed it. As much as, me and you bicker, that might be my favorite part.
Yeah.
I really enjoy making this podcast with you, Honor. I really enjoy that we have an audience that cares to listen.
Yeah.
It's so cool.
Yeah, it is really awesome. I'm really glad that you came up to me at that party that one day and said, "Hey, have you ever heard of Dust Chrysalis?"
It's about a spaceman.
It's about a space.
All right, that's enough of being serious.
Sam, I hate you.
I hate you too. All right, everyone. If this comes out in time, have a happy holidays.
Have a good end of the year. And here's to the next one.
We'll see you with more podcasts in 2025.
Look forward to the Joe Rogan episode.
Yay! Bye!
Bye!
Some skin, bro. We made it a whole year. How the f did we do that?
20 episodes.
That's insane.
That's crazy.
It is, and you know what? It really does prove that the internet is a lawless place.
That we're really stubborn.